what do you think is happening from the time, let's say you were in med school in, was it the 80s or 90s, let's say, to now where we're in, 2023? What's the difference? Like it wasn't, I mean, you could certainly make some argument that now there's more women in their 50s and 40s lifting weights. We talk a lot about maybe that wasn't happening so much then. But then there's been other changes like phthalates in the environment and environmental toxicants and weed killer and glyphosate, and the vaccine schedule has changed. Like what is it that you, or I mean, maybe it's some of those, maybe it's all of them, maybe I haven't even scratched the surface. Like what is driving that change where we used to see someone in their 70s, let's say,
Yeah.
presenting with SCI, and now we've had this phasic shift where we're starting to see these women and men, but we know that Alzheimer's is primarily a female driven disease. Why are we seeing these 52-year-old women now presenting with SCI and MCI?
Yeah, that's such a good point. And you were very kind to say 80s and 90s. I was actually in medical school in the 70s. So that was I'm an old guy, a long, long time ago.
You look fabulous.
Thank you very much. So do you. So here's the thing. That there are epidemiological studies showing that, what I mentioned about young people is not just one observation. If you look at population studies, the greatest increases in Alzheimer's are in the 40s and 50s. It's amazing. It's scary. You're right. So as you pointed out, what is driving this? Well, there are very interesting studies. If you remember the studies on BRCA, was showing that BRCA associated cancers like breast cancer, this is a strong genetic association. But if you go back for years and years ago, the 40s and 50s, it actually didn't seem to drive. There was not that association. So in other words, it's not just genetic. There's something else going on. And this is what we've heard from Professor Robert Lustig over the years. It's what we've heard from Jeffrey Bland over the years. It's what we've heard from Mark Hyman and David Perlmutter. Everyone who's been saying, wait a minute, we are exposed to a poorer food than before. We are exposed to more processed food than before. We have more inflammation than before. What our research showed, we're on the research side, and what our research showed is that this thing we call Alzheimer's, this brain degeneration where you're losing synapses over the years, boils down to two major players. One of them is energetics. As your energetics drop, you increase your risk for Alzheimer's. That is not supporting those 500 trillion synapses that you have in your brain. And that is cerebral blood flow, oxygenation, mitochondrial function, ketone level, all the things you know about that are critical for energetics. And on the other hand, it's demand, which is too much inflammation. The amyloid is fascinating. This has been vilified in Alzheimer's and said, oh, this is what causes Alzheimer's. And as you said earlier, no, it's a response. What it does is very interesting. It responds to reduced energy, by the way, but it also is part of the innate immune system. So when your brain experiences the P. gingivalis from your oral microbiome, what does it do? It sequesters it and kills it with the amyloid. That's how you get these plaques. These plaques have in them the various pathogens, and it can be Candida, actually, which has remarkable access to your brain, unfortunately. It can be Borrelia. It can be T. denticola. It can be things related to leaky gut. Whatever it is, your brain responds with this inflammatory response. So the bottom line is low energetics, high inflammation. And interestingly, amyloid is mostly part of the innate immune system's memory. And the memory is stored in three locations: your bone marrow, your tissue macrophages, which in the brain, of course, are the microglia, and then interestingly, in your endothelial cells, which is why these people have increased microthrombi, just as you see with COVID-19, for example. So, and this has been COVID is a huge issue for the future for Alzheimer's disease because it triggers the very things that increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So all of us who've had COVID, and that's most of the people, are at risk for the future. So this is, again, why I say, please, if you're 40 years of age or older, please get a cognoscopy. And by the way, it's much more pleasant than a colonoscopy. And please check out and see where you stand and get on active prevention so that nobody has to worry. One of the things that I have said before, and in the TED Talk, for example, was that this is the first generation that shouldn't have to fear Alzheimer's. So my generation, that was a big concern. But for your generation and subsequent generations, there should be no fear. This should not be a major problem because we can do so much. And the other thing that's added, of course, is earlier biomarkers. But it is the change in food. It is the increase in inflammation. It is the exposures and the toxins that you mentioned. These are part of the drag on that system. So you've got this well-oiled, beautiful ability for neuroplasticity to make and maintain new synapses. And now you're putting too much drag on it and not enough support for it. So it has no other option but to protect itself and downsize. And that is what this amyloid is showing us.